The Widow's Cows Complete Story. Part 1. Kate Anderson didn't cry at the auction. Not when the auctioneer's voice carried across the gravel yard like a preacher calling the faithful. Not when neighbors she'd known for 20 years avoided her eyes. Not even when they rolled Rob's Lincoln Welder out into the May sunlight like it was just another piece of metal that needed a new home. 6 weeks. That's how long Rob had been gone. Heart attack. Age 47 one moment, raking the South 40, and the next moment sprawled in spring clover, with his hand still gripping the tractor's throttle. The men from church had finished that field for her. The women had brought casseroles in glass dishes with masking tape labels. Then everyone had gone back to their own lives, their own problems, their own certainties about what would happen next. The farm hadn't stopped. 180 acres of black Iowa soil. 23 Holstein cows in the barn, feed bills at the co-op that wouldn't wait for grief to settle into something manageable. Kate stood on the porch in Rob's old barn coat, the one with the torn pocket and grease stains that wouldn't wash out, and watched strangers touch his things. Good welder, someone said. Rob could lay a bead straight as surveyor's line. She nodded once. Didn't correct him. Rob could do a lot of things straight. Drive a tractor row so true you could measure it with a ruler. Balance the farm books in his head while he milked. Tell you which heifer would calve within 12 hours, just by the way she shifted her weight. What he couldn't do was outwork a heart that had carried too much for too long. The auction wasn't the farm. That mattered. She was selling the extra equipment, only the second tractor they'd planned to fix someday. The 6-bottom plow, too big for their acreage. The grain drill with wooden boxes Rob had bought at an estate sale, thinking he'd restore it. Someday had ended on a Thursday afternoon in April, with the ambulance lights turning the barn red and blue. A Ford F-250 rolled into the yard and stopped hard. Too clean, too new. Ronald Mitchell stepped out before the engine fully died and shut the door with more force than necessary. He looked around like he was evaluating property already in his name. Ron had inherited 160 acres in 1964 and turned it into 480 by 1976. Borrowed Heavy talked bigger. First man in Cedar County with a brand new John Deere 4430 with a cab and a radio. He believed in scale the way other men believed in scripture. The coat pulled tight across Kate's shoulders as she watched him approach. 44 years old, blonde-brown hair going gray at the temples, green eyes that hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since the funeral. Her hands were weathered from morning milkings and fence repairs, her German Scandinavian ancestry written in the sharp bones of her face. Ron took off his cap. Kate, I'm sorry about Rob. Thank you. She didn't invite him to sit. He looked past her toward the barn, where the Holsteins were visible through the open door, then back. This doesn't have to drag out. You don't need to sell it piece by piece. I'll make you a clean offer. Land, barnhouse, cows, all of it. Cash. You can move into town. Small place. No more milking at 5 in the morning. No more frozen pipes in January. You've done enough. The tone landed wrong. Not cruel, exactly, not loud, just certain. Certain she couldn't manage. Certain the farm without Rob was already finished. The land isn't for sale. Neither are the cows. He smiled like she'd misunderstood something basic. Kate, be realistic. Dairy takes 2 people minimum. The feeding, the milking, fieldwork, repairs. You can't run this alone. It'll break you before winter. I'm offering you a way out before it gets ugly. She stepped closer so he wouldn't mistake her voice. I'm not looking for a way out. Silence hung between them like smoke. He shifted his weight, adjusted his cap. You'll change your mind when the cold hits, when something big breaks and you can't fix it. When the mortgage payment comes due? We don't have a mortgage. Ron's jaw tightened. Equipment loans then. Operating credit. Rob paid cash for everything we own. If we couldn't afford it outright, we didn't buy it. That stopped him. His eyes moved from her face to the barn to the machinery lined up for auction, recalculating something. Then, you're a fool for not leveraging what you have. You could have doubled this operation years ago. Kate felt the weight of Rob's coat, the smell of diesel and hay still caught in the fabric. Or we could have lost everything years ago when the market turned. Like the Johnsons did. like the Schmidts. "You can come back in winter," she added. "Today is just an auction." She turned and went inside. The screen door hit hard behind her. From the kitchen window, she watched Ron stand there for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't spit out. Then he walked back to his truck, got in, and drove away faster than he'd arrived. Kate poured coffee into Rob's chipped mug and sat down at the table with the ledger. 23 cows, all paid for. Land paid for. Barn paid for. No mortgage, no equipment loans. Only the co-op feed bill sitting at $6,100. The auction would clear that. Rob's rule had been simple enough that even a 20-year-old farm wife could understand it. If you can't pay cash, you don't own it. It owns you. She'd agreed with him then. Now that rule was the only thing standing between her and the bank. That night, she walked through the barn alone. The cows shifted and breathed steam, rising in the cool spring air. Their eyes caught the lamplight, patient and undemanding. "We're staying," she said quietly, not sure if she meant the cows or herself. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who'd already written you off as a failure? The question would haunt her through the long months ahead, though she'd never speak it aloud. The first winter came early and hard. By November, the wind found every crack in the north-facing wall. By December, snow piled so high against the barn, she had to shovel a path just to open the door. And then, on one January morning, when the thermometer read 18 below and the sky was the color of old ice, the Farmall M wouldn't start. Kate turned the key. The engine groaned, coughed, died. She tried again. Same thing. Nothing that would catch. 23 cows waited for feed. The manure spreader sat full. The silo auger needed power. A dead tractor in July was inconvenient. In January, it was a threat. She climbed down slowly, breath clouding white. "All right," she said to no one. "What are you doing? Fuel first. Half-tank sediment bowl clear." She pulled the spark plug wire and cranked. No spark, not even a flicker. Magneto, then. Rob had shown her once years back when they were still newlyweds, and everything felt like an adventure instead of a test. Fuel, spark, air. Engines are systems, not mysteries. You can learn systems. She could hear his voice so clearly it hurt. Kate went to the workshop and pulled the International Harvester Service Manual off the shelf. Pages soft from years of use, margins filled with Rob's handwriting. She read the section on the Farmall H Magneto. Impulse coupling breaker points gap at 0.015 inch. She didn't rush. Rushing broke things. The Magneto came off with 4 bolts. She carried it inside like it might shatter. The breaker points were black and fused exactly like the manual's diagram of what not to have. There you are. She filed them clean with an old nail file from the bathroom drawer. Set the gap with a feeler gauge Rob had marked with red paint. Reassembled carefully, checking twice. Timed it the way the manual described, listening for the snap. At top dead center, her ear pressed close to cold metal. Back on the tractor seat, her hands shook once, then steadied. She pulled the choke and hit the starter. It coughed, caught, roared. Kate let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The cows were fed, the spreader emptied, the auger filled feed bunks. By the time the sun cleared the eastern tree line, the morning work was done. She sat on the tractor afterward, engine idling, and cried for the first time since Rob's funeral. The tears came from something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. The knowledge that her hands could do what needed doing. That she understood systems. That lonely and capable could exist in the same woman at the same time. Nobody called to ask how she'd managed. Nobody stopped by to check if she needed help. The isolation wasn't cruel, just factual. A widow alone on a farm in winter wasn't interesting enough for conversation. That was the day something shifted. Not in the township, in her. Spring came grudgingly. By April, the ground was soft enough to work. Kate sold 3 cows numbers 8, 15, and 22, all with chronic mastitis that drained time and ate into milk production. Jim Sullivan at the co-op raised his eyebrows when she brought the check, but said nothing. People were watching, waiting for the collapse they'd predicted. She started an artificial insemination program. $12 per cow versus $800 a year to keep a bull. The math was simple. The county agent came out, showed her the technique, left her with a tank of frozen semen and instructions written on a 3x5 card. At night, after milking, she studied production records by lamplight. Which cows gave the most milk? Which had the fewest health problems? Which calves showed the strongest genetics? No sentiment allowed. The herd wasn't memory. It was income. Ron Mitchell expanded that spring too, bought 200 acres west of her fence line, tore out hedgerows to make one massive field, traded his 430 for a newer International Harvester 1466 Turbo with dual rear wheels. People gathered at the co-op to talk about it. That's the future, someone said. Kate listened and said nothing. She wasn't blind. The big tractor looked powerful. The cab had air conditioning. It made her Farmall M look like a child's toy. But she also knew what the 1466 cost, knew what interest rates were climbing toward. The radio talked about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, about tightening credit. Most farmers ignored the words. She didn't. One evening, she sat at Rob's desk and realized something simple. If milk prices dropped 20%, she would survive. If feed costs rose 30%, she would adjust. She had no loan payment. Ron did. The difference between them wasn't courage or vision. It was exposure. Her daughter, Rebecca, visited in late May, 19 years old, finishing nursing school in Des Moines, blonde, like her mother but with Rob's dark eyes. They sat on the porch drinking iced tea while the sun dropped toward the western fields. "Mom, you're aging 10 years in one. You need to sell this place." Kate set her glass down carefully. "Your father built this farm so we'd never owe anyone anything. Dad's gone. He wouldn't want you killing yourself to prove a point. I'm not proving a point. I'm keeping what's ours." Becca's voice rose. "It's just dirt and cows. You could have a life in town, see people not be so alone all the time. Your dad's wisdom isn't gone just because he is." Becca left before dark. Didn't say goodbye, just got in her car and drove away with gravel spitting from the tires. Kate watched the taillights disappear and felt the loneliness settle deeper. Her daughter didn't understand. Maybe couldn't understand until she'd built something herself and faced the choice between keeping it and letting it go. The church women were worse. Every Sunday after service, they clustered near the fellowship hall, voices lowered but not enough. Betty Morrison led the pack, 60-something, with iron gray hair and opinions she wielded like scripture. When's Kate going to face reality? Betty's voice carried across the room while Kate was in the kitchen refilling the coffee urn. Pride before the fall girls. Mark my words, she'll be bankrupt by Christmas. Kate set the urn down and walked out through the back door, drove home alone. Didn't go back to church for 3 months. The loneliness carved her hollow. No romantic prospects. Men were either intimidated by a woman running a farm or assumed she needed saving, and she had no patience for either. Sunday dinners alone at the kitchen table. Conversations with the cows because they were better listeners than most people. Morning Bessie. Morning Clover. Morning Daisy. They didn't judge, didn't offer advice, just chewed their cud and gave milk and required competence instead of explanation. One evening she found Rob's barn coat hanging in the closet and pulled it on during the evening milking. It still smelled like him, diesel and hay, and the faint sweetness of alfalfa. She cried into the collar where no one could see. Summer 1978 came hot and stayed that way. By July, the corn was head-high and the pastures needed mowing. Kate hired a high school boy to help with haying, paid him cash at the end of each day. The work got done. The farm kept turning. Then came the night the sky opened up. 2 a.m, Kate woke to sound. Not thunder exactly, though there was that too. Something else. A bellowing that cut through sleep like a blade. She was running before she was fully awake, barefoot across the yard in her nightgown. The barn glowed orange. Smoke poured from the hayloft where lightning had punched through the roof and found fuel. 3 seconds. That's all she had to decide. Fight the fire or save the animals. She chose. The stanchions opened with practiced hands. 1, 2, 3. The cows moved slowly, confused by smoke and noise. Kate shouted, slapped flanks, drove them toward the door. 4, 5, 6. The heat built behind her. 7, 8, 9. Bessie balked at the threshold, and Kate shoved her hard, no gentleness left. 10, 11, 12. Smoke filled her lungs. She couldn't see, could only count. 13, 14, 15. Keep moving. Keep pushing. 16, 17. 18. Her eyes watered. The roof groaned overhead. 19, 20, 21. Almost there. Almost safe. 22, 23. All of them. Every single one. She drove the herd to the east pasture and turned back just as the barn roof collapsed. Flames shot 30 feet into the black sky. The hay was gone. 4,000 bales, $5,000 worth of feed turned to ash and smoke, while Kate stood barefoot in wet grass and watched her margin shrink. By dawn, the fire was out. The volunteer department had saved the barn's skeleton, but 70% of the hay was destroyed. The stanchions were intact. The milking equipment survived, but the damage ran deep. Jim Sullivan came by at sunrise with coffee in a thermos. Didn't say much, just stood beside her and looked at the wreckage. Insurance will cover the structure. Not the hay, not all of it. He nodded. You got any reserve? Kate did the math in her head. Saved $9,200 since Rob's death. Would need $4,800 to replace the hay. Another $10,000 for repairs the insurance wouldn't cover. Jim poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Ron Mitchell's been asking around about your place. I'm sure he has. Just thought you should know. Ron showed up before noon, drove his clean truck right up to the barn like he owned the approach. Got out and looked at the damage with an expression Kate couldn't quite read. This is God telling you to stop. Kate was too tired to be angry. God didn't send you, Ron. Your banker did. What's that supposed to mean? Means you need more land to cover your debt payments. And I'm not selling. His face hardened. I'm offering you $95,000 for a burned barn and exhausted pasture. That's generous. It's opportunistic. There's a difference. You're making a mistake. Then it's mine to make. He left without another word. Kate watched him go and felt nothing. No triumph, no anger. Just the bone-deep tiredness of someone who'd been up all night saving what she could. The bank called on Monday. Mr. Richard Porter, vice president, voice smooth as cream. Mrs. Anderson, I heard about the fire. We can help you through this. $12,000 at 11.5% 5-year term. Very reasonable under the circumstances. Kate sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, ran the numbers twice. What the neighbors didn't know was that every night she sat here doing exactly this calculation. How many bad months could she survive? The answer stayed steady at 8. Ron Mitchell could survive too. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Porter. I'll be paying cash. Silence on the other end. Then cash insurance payout plus my savings. I won't need a loan. Mrs. Anderson, you're being unwise. You should keep that cash reserve for emergencies. This is an emergency, and I'm handling it. She hung up before he could argue further. The insurance check came for $8,800. Kate took that plus her savings and paid for everything outright. Hired a contractor for the structural beam replacement. Did the roofing work herself, spending August on a ladder in the heat with hammer and nails and determination. Bought used hay from a Mennonite farm 40 miles south, 3,200 bales for $3,800. By September, the barn was repaired. Her savings account had $800 left, but the debt column was still empty, still zero. The exhaustion sat in her bones like old weather. Some nights she couldn't sleep, just lay in bed and listened to the house settle and wondered if she was doing the right thing or just being stubborn. The line between them felt razor thin. One of those nights she went out to the porch and sat in the dark. The barn stood solid against the stars' roof, new and tight. The cows were bedded down safe. The field stretched away into darkness. All of it hers, all of it paid for all of it, waiting for her to decide what came next. Rob. I hope I'm doing this right, because I've never been this scared and this sure at the same time. The wind didn't answer, the stars didn't shift, but somewhere deep in her chest, something settled. Resolve, maybe. The kind that grows from hard choices and harder nights, and the knowledge that owing nothing would matter more than having everything when the weather turned bad. She went back inside and slept until the alarm rang at 4:30. The cows needed milking, the farm needed running, and Kate Anderson needed to prove that freedom wasn't about doing whatever you wanted. It was about not being forced to do what you didn't. Part 2. The summer of 1979 arrived with heat that felt personal. By mid-June, the sky had turned a hard, cloudless blue that stretched from horizon to horizon without mercy. The kind of blue that painters couldn't capture because it held no depth, no promise, only relentless certainty. 0.4 inches of rain fell between June and August. Normal was 11. Kate watched the corn leaves curl tight against themselves, trying to protect what little moisture they held. The pastures went brown by the 4th of July. Across the fence line, Ron Mitchell's fields looked worse, 480 acres of stressed crops drinking borrowed money through irrigation pipes that ran 24 hours a day. The electric pump hummed day and night, pulling from the creek until the water level dropped low enough that rocks showed through. Kate could hear it from her kitchen window, a constant mechanical whine that spoke of desperation disguised as determination. She sold her corn in early July, took $2.85 a bushel when the market was climbing toward $3 when everyone else was holding for $4. Jim Sullivan at the co-op raised his eyebrows but ran the sale. "You sure about this?" "Kate price is still rising. I'd rather have cash now than promises later." The check cleared for $4,200. Not spectacular, but real. She used $3,200 of it to buy hay before the drought drove prices through the ceiling. Found a farmer in Worth County who'd put up his crop early before the rain quit. 2,800 bales at $1.35 each when the going rate was already pushing $2 and climbing. Kate culled 2 more cows in August. Numbers 17 and 19, both aged 9 and 10, production dropping, maintenance costs rising. Sold them for beef and put the money straight into savings. The herd stood at 28 now, up from 23 after Rob died. Every animal earned its keep, or it left. Ron's approach was different. She watched from a distance, impossible not to when your farms shared a mile of fence line. He ran irrigation equipment around the clock. His electricity bill had to be running north of $3,000 a month. The corn he managed to save went straight into storage bins, grain, waiting for prices to hit $4 a bushel, so the gamble would pay off. Late August, Kate stopped at the co-op for mineral supplements and salt blocks. Ron was ahead of her in line, ordering on credit. The air between them held the weight of things unsaid. Since the fire, since his failed offers, since she'd proven capable of surviving what he'd predicted would break her. He glanced back as she set her supplies on the counter. "You're always buying small, Kate. I buy what I can pay for." "Market's going to $4. "You're leaving money on the table." She counted out bills, exact change. "Tables turn, Ron." "I'd rather leave money than owe it." His laugh came out sharp. "That's why you'll always be small time." Kate picked up her purchases and walked out without responding. Let him have the last word. Words didn't milk cows or pay bills, but the loneliness cut deeper than his dismissal. Every interaction reminded her how isolated she'd become. No romantic prospects. The few single men in Cedar County either saw her as a project that needed fixing or a challenge to their own competence, and she had patience for neither. The married couples at church treated her like a curiosity, someone to be pitied at potlucks and forgotten afterward. Sunday dinners were the worst. Just Kate and a plate of leftovers at the kitchen table. Rob's empty chair pushed in tight, like maybe if she didn't look at it, the absence wouldn't hurt so much. The cows became her conversation. "Morning, Bessie. How's that left rear quarter? Morning, Clover. You're looking good. Morning, Daisy. Let's check that swelling." They listened without judgment, gave milk without complaint, required competence instead of explanation. Some evenings during milking, she'd pull on Rob's barn coat. The fabric worn thin now, the smell fading but not gone, and let herself cry where no one could see. The coat was armor and comfort, both a reminder that she'd chosen this loneliness over the alternative, and the alternative was debt. What the neighbors didn't know was that every night she sat at Rob's desk running the same calculation over and over. How many bad months could she survive? The answer stayed steady at 8. Ron Mitchell could survive 2, maybe 3, if he got lucky. The difference wasn't intelligence or work ethic. It was exposure. Winter came and went. Spring 1980 arrived with news that changed everything. Soviet troops rolled into Afghanistan on December 27, 1979. By January, President Carter announced a grain embargo. American farmers couldn't sell to their biggest international buyer. The market didn't just dip, it crashed. Corn dropped from $3.10 to $2.15 a bushel in 3 weeks. Kate heard about it on the radio during morning milking and felt her stomach tighten. She'd sold at $2.85, had the cash already spent on hay and feed and repairs. Ron had stored 8,200 bushels waiting for $4. The math was brutal. At $4, he'd have made $32,800. At $2.15, he'd get $17,630. Loss of $15,170, plus storage costs of another $2,400. She felt recognition settle in her chest instead of triumph. This could have been her standing in an open field, watching the storm roll in with nowhere to hide. February brought the proof. Kate was in the barn doing morning chores when she heard it. A metallic scream that carried across frozen fields, the sound of expensive machinery dying hard. She walked to the doorway and looked out. Ron's International 1466 Turbo sat dead in the middle of his Northfield steam, rising from under the hood like a wounded animal breathing its last. Ron climbed down slow, opened the side panel, stared inside, closed it, kicked the tire once, not hard, not the way the old Ron would have, just a tired gesture from a man who already knew what came next. He sat in the cab for 20 minutes while Kate watched from her kitchen window. Finally, Linda Mitchell drove out in their station wagon. Ron got in without looking back at the tractor. The tow truck arrived 2 hours later. Jim Sullivan told her the damage that afternoon when she stopped for feed. Torque, amplifier failure, plus cracked engine block. $8,900 for the repair. Ron asked if they could bill him 90 days. Bank said cash only. Kate nodded, paid for her salt blocks, drove home. That night, she sat at the desk and stared at her ledger. Savings had rebuilt to $18,400. She could theoretically loan Ron the money. Could be the bigger person, show mercy, help a neighbor. But you can't rescue someone from leverage by adding more leverage. The problem wasn't the tractor repair. The problem was the $500,000 in debt. Underneath it, interest compounding, daily margins getting thinner with every market shift. Loaning him $9,000 would be like bailing water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon while pretending the hull wasn't cracked. She closed the ledger and went to bed. March brought Ron to her door. Kate was repairing fence in the south pasture when she saw him walking up the gravel road. Not driving, walking. 3 miles from his place to hers on a cold morning with wind that cut through canvas like it wasn't there. He stopped at the fence line. Didn't come closer without permission. Kate, Ron. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had happened since Rob died, since the auction, since he'd offered to buy her out and she'd refused. Can I rent your FarmLife just for spring planting? My equipment's down and parts are delayed. Kate studied him. The swagger was gone, replaced by something harder to witness. Desperation trying to wear dignity's clothes. $200 per week, plus fuel. You return it exactly as you got it. His eyes widened slightly. That's more than fair. It's business, Ron, not charity. He nodded. Understood. When can I pick it up tomorrow morning? Cash before you take it. They shook hands across the fence. His palm was rough, callous, the hand of someone who still worked even when the numbers stopped adding up. Kate watched him walk back down the road and felt the weight of what was coming. The storm was here, and it wouldn't pass quick. Ron used the FarmLife for 6 weeks. Paid on time every Friday, cash in an envelope. Returned it clean with a full tank. Said thank you exactly once and never asked for anything else. But the squeeze was tightening around him like a fist. June 1980, prime rate hit 15%. Ron's operating loan adjusted from 13 to 17% overnight. Monthly payment jumped from $1,400 to $2,100. 40% increase that his margins couldn't absorb. October, he sold equipment. An extra grain wagon for $2,800. An old planter for $1,900. Applied it to the operating loan and barely touched the principal. March 1981 prime rate hit 18%. Cedar County had never seen anything like it. Old men at the co-op talked about the Depression, like maybe it was coming back wearing different clothes. Ron sold breeding cattle that spring. Good stock animals he'd spent years developing. Took whatever the auction yard offered because he needed cash more than he needed genetics. September 1981, 19.5%. The radio talked about Paul Volcker and monetary policy and fighting inflation. Kate listened while milking and understood that the men making these decisions in Washington had never stood in a barn at 5 in the morning wondering if they could make the math work. April 1982, rates started dropping, 16%, but it was too late. The damage was done. You couldn't bleed that heavy that long and expect to recover because someone finally thought to apply a tourniquet. Kate tracked it all from a distance, with the grim attention of someone watching a version of her own story that could have been. Every decision she'd made since Rob died, refusing loans paying cash, moving slow when everyone else moved fast, had been vindicated by Ron's failure rather than her success. Her herd grew steady. 28 cows became 31 in 1980, 33 in 1981, 35 by 1982. Production per cow climbed from 16,800 pounds to 19,200. County average was stuck at 14,800. The AI breeding program was paying off. Better genetics, stronger calves, fewer health problems. Every dollar she'd saved by not borrowing compounded into choices she could make freely. Cull the weak, keep the strong. Build slowly towards something sustainable instead of chasing growth that required perfect weather and perfect markets to survive. Her savings rebuilt too, 4,200 in 1979 after the fire, 9,800 by end of 1980, 14,600 in 1981, 18,400 by September 1982. Still no debt, not a dollar owed to anyone. September 23rd, 1982. Kate drove past Ron's place and saw the orange notice nailed to the fence post. Didn't stop. Didn't need to read it. Already knew what it said, because she'd seen those notices on 3 other farms that year. That night, she sat on the porch and stared at the western sky turning purple and red. Couldn't sleep. One different choice in May 1976. One loan to tide her over, one decision to leverage what she had instead of protecting it, and she'd be the one watching strangers nail foreclosure notices to her fence. The auction was set for November 20th. The morning came gray and cold temperature, hovering around 34 degrees drizzle. That wasn't quite rain, but soaked through fabric all the same. Kate drove to Ron's place at 8:30. 90 people were already there, scattered across the yard, like crows picking over something dead. She parked away from the main cluster and stayed in the truck for a moment, hands on the wheel. Tried to identify what she was feeling. Grief, maybe. The grief of watching a possible version of yourself play out to its bitter conclusion. Ron and Linda stood near the house. He looked 10 years older than 56 shoulders, bent face carved with lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Linda kept her hand on his arm, like maybe if she held tight enough, she could keep him from disappearing entirely. Kate got out and walked toward the machinery line. The International 1466 Turbo stood first, paint-dulled tires still good. The John Deere 4430 behind it, cab glass clean radio antenna bent. Grain bins, planters, combines. Everything Ron had leveraged into his vision of the future lined up for public sale. The auctioneer was Vernon Schmidt from over in Mitchell County. Good man, fair voice, no pleasure in this work. He started with the 1,466 at 9 sharp. Who'll give me $25,000 to start? Beautiful machine, dual wheels, turbo diesel, barely 10,000 hours. Silence. 20,000 then. Do I hear 20? A dealer from Des Moines raised his card. 18. Vernon worked it up slow. 19, 20, 21. Stalled at 23. The bank representative stood off to the side, stone-faced, watching their collateral sell for half what they'd loaned against it. Going once. Going twice. Sold for $23,400. Ron flinched. Not visibly, but Kate saw it. A small collapse behind his eyes. He'd paid $42,000 for that tractor in 1977, still owed $28,000. The bank would take the $23,000 and write off the rest as loss. Ron would take nothing. The 4430 went for $19,200. Paid $32,000, owed $22,000. Another bank loss. Another piece of Ron's vision sold for fractions. The land drew no whole parcel bids. 480 acres that Ron had assembled piece by piece over 18 years. Nobody wanted it complete. The bank divided it. 240 west 120, north 120 south. We'll be auctioning those parcels individually over the next 60 days, Vernon announced. Interested parties can contact First National. Kate watched Ron's face. Whatever he was feeling stayed locked behind a mask of exhausted dignity. The auction moved to smaller equipment: grain wagons, augers, hand tools. The crowd thinned as dealers loaded their purchases. By 11:30, only the locals remained, picking through what was left. That's when Kate saw it. At the back of the line, covered in dust, one tire flat, Alice Chalmers WD-45. Rob's old tractor from before they were married. The one he'd taught her to plow on in spring 1967, both of them newlyweds playing at farming before they understood what the word really meant. Her chest tightened. She'd assumed that tractor was long gone, sold or scrapped decades ago. But Ron must have bought it at some estate sale, kept it as a backup that never got used. Vernon barely glanced at it. "What'll you give me for this old Alice? Been sitting a while." Silence. Nobody wanted a relic. Kate raised her hand. $100. Heads turned. Vernon looked relieved. Sold to the lady for $100. She paid cash to the clerk, signed the bill of sale. Didn't look at Ron, but felt his eyes on her. Afterward, as people were leaving, he approached. Walked slow like his joints hurt. "You didn't have to do that." Kate tucked the bill of sale into her coat pocket. "I'm not doing it for you, Ron. I'm doing it for Rob." He loved that tractor. Ron nodded once, looked at the ground. "I used to think you were making a mistake. Staying small, refusing to expand. Markets change faster than we do." "That's what I'm learning." He walked away without another word. Linda was waiting by their station wagon, the last thing they owned outright. They drove off while the tow trucks were still loading equipment. Kate stood in the yard until everyone left. The house looked smaller, somehow, emptier, like the auction had taken more than machinery. It had taken possibility. What nobody in that cold November yard knew was that she'd lain awake the night before, grieving rather than celebrating. She understood something the spectators didn't. This could have been her. One different choice in May 1976, one loan to tide her over, one decision to trust that markets always rise and weather always cooperates, and she'd be the one watching strangers turn her life into line items in an auction catalog. The drive home felt longer than it was. Kate kept seeing Ron's face when the 1,466 sold, kept hearing Vernon's voice calling prices that didn't add up to what had been paid, kept thinking about leverage and exposure and the difference between growing fast and growing sustainable. She pulled into her own yard and looked at what she'd built. 180 acres, 35 cows. FarmLife parked by the barn, old but running. Savings account at $18,400. Debt at zero. Not impressive by Ron's standards. Not the future everyone had expected farming to become. Just a widow and a herd and land that belonged to her because she'd refused to let anything else own it first. That night, she opened the ledger and ran the calculation one more time. How many bad months could she survive now? Answer 8. Ron Mitchell had survived 0. The difference wasn't intelligence or work ethic or vision. It was understanding that what you don't borrow is more powerful than what you do. That freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's not being forced to do what you don't. She closed the ledger and looked at Rob's empty chair. "Thank you for teaching me to walk slow, for showing me that staying unlevered mattered more than growing fast." The chair didn't answer. The house settled around her. Outside, the cows were bedded down, safe, the barn was solid, the land was hers. And tomorrow morning at 4:30, the alarm would ring and the work would start again, because that's what farming was. Not auctions and leverage and gambles on perfect weather. Just showing up every day and doing what needed doing and staying free enough to keep doing it. Kate turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Part 3. December brought Richard Porter to her door. The banker arrived at 3 in the afternoon, unusual enough that Kate knew the visit carried weight before he opened his briefcase on her kitchen table. "Mrs. Anderson, we have a situation with the Mitchell property. 240 acres west of your fence line. We can't move it as a whole parcel. Market's too tight." Kate poured coffee and waited. Porter was 50-ish gray at the temples, the kind of careful that came from watching too many farms fail. "We're prepared to offer it at $720 per acre. That's $172,800 total. Cash transaction, quick close. The number sat between them like a test. Kate did calculations she'd already done a dozen times in her head. Savings at $18,400. But Rob's life insurance money received in September 1976 and parked in a credit union certificate of deposit at 8.5%. She'd never touched it. Never spent a dollar. Let it compound for 6 years. Principal of $150,000 had grown to $182,000. That was her capital. The foundation Rob had built without knowing he was building it. Life insurance he'd taken out in 1965 when Christopher was born, and money was tight, but the principal mattered more than the premium payment. I'll pay $170,000. Cash. One condition. Porter's eyebrows rose. What condition you offer Ronald Mitchell employment managing the West acreage for me? Rent him his house at $1 per year. Wage of $16,500 annually plus housing. The banker set down his coffee cup with care. Mrs. Anderson, after everything he said about you, I don't need revenge, Mr. Porter. I need a farm manager who knows that soil. Ron made mistakes, but he's not lazy and he's not stupid. I need help. He needs work. That's farming, not feelings. Porter studied her like she'd revealed something unexpected. Some people would want to see him suffer more. Suffering doesn't grow corn. Knowledge does. Ron knows farming. He just learned the wrong lessons about money. I'd rather hire someone who learned those lessons the expensive way than someone who hasn't learned them at all. The deal closed January 3rd, 1983. Kate paid $170,000 in cash, leaving $12,000 in savings, plus monthly milk checks. She owned 420 acres now. Zero debt. Ron Mitchell managed the western parcel for wages he could actually live on. The first months were careful. Ron showed up at 6:30 every morning, worked until dark, asked permission before making any decision larger than which field to plow first. Kate watched him relearn humility, the way a man relearns walking after his legs have been broken. By fall, he started offering advice, tentative at first. Westfield might benefit from cover crop rotation. Rye over winter, plow it under in spring. Show me the numbers. He brought her a cost breakdown written in pencil on lined paper. Seed cost, labor hours, projected soil improvement, expected yield increase over 3 years. The math was solid. Do it. Something shifted between them after that. They'd built mutual respect on shared understanding of failure's lessons. Ron had learned what Kate already knew, that what you don't borrow is more powerful than what you do. The farm grew steadier. 35 cows in 1983 became 40 in 1984, 44 in 1985, 48 in 1986. Production per cow climbed to 20,100 pounds, while the county average stayed stuck below 15,000. The AI breeding program had transformed the herd into something approaching excellence. Not the biggest operation in Cedar County, but possibly the most efficient. Savings rebuilt faster now. 28,000 by end of 1983. 47,000 in 1984, 68,000 in 1985. By 1986, she had 94,000 in the bank and 420 acres generating income with no debt service bleeding margin. Young farmers started asking her advice. She gave it sparingly, never preachy, just factual. How much should I borrow to expand? How much can you survive losing? They didn't like that answer. Wanted formulas for success, not cautions about failure. She understood. At 25, she'd wanted the same thing. It took Rob dying and a barn burning and watching neighbors fail to teach her that survival was the prerequisite for everything else. Ron taught too, though his lessons came harder. A kid named Timothy Hayes, 28 years old with new bank approval for $180,000, stopped by the farm one Saturday, asking Ron's opinion. Should I do it? Buy the Olson place, expand my herd. Ron was greasing a disc harrow. He set down the grease gun and wiped his hands on a rag before answering. Can you survive 3 bad years in a row? I'll only need 1 good year to Ron cut him off. That's what I said in 1977. Then I had 3 bad ones. If you can't survive the worst, don't bet on the best. Tim shifted his weight defensive. But you were over-leveraged. I'm being smart about it. I was being smart too. Had spreadsheets projections a 5-year plan. Markets don't care about your plan, so you're saying never borrow. I'm saying know what you're risking. I risked everything and lost it. You want to risk everything, that's your choice. Just don't pretend the risk isn't there. Kate watched from the barn door, didn't interrupt. Ron had earned the right to his lessons. Let him teach them. Tim left looking uncertain. Bought the land anyway. Lost it 3 years later when milk prices crashed in 1989. Some lessons couldn't be taught, only learned. Spring 1985 brought change Kate didn't expect. May 7th morning, milking, she felt her chest tighten like someone had wrapped steel bands around her ribs. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. The stanchion became the only solid thing in a tilting world. She grabbed it and held on while the barn spun. Managed to stay conscious through sheer stubbornness, though the world grayed at the edges and her left arm went numb. Ron found her 5 minutes later, still gripping the stanchion cows, unmilked and restless. Kate, sit, now. I'm fine. You're white as milk and your hand won't let go of that bar. Sit. He got her to a hay bale and called the ambulance while she argued. Waste of money, she kept saying. Just need a minute. But her voice sounded thin even to herself. Doctor. William Thompson met them at the county hospital. Ran tests, took blood, hooked her to machines that beeped and measured things she couldn't see. 4 hours later, he sat down beside her bed with results. Stress-induced angina, Mrs. Anderson. Your heart is telling you to slow down. I can't afford to slow down. You can't afford not to. You keep pushing this hard. Next time won't be a warning. Rebecca arrived an hour later, still in scrubs from her shift at Mercy Hospital in Des Moines. 33 years old now, married to Timothy Harris, who worked as an accountant, 2 kids at home with a sitter. She looked at Kate with Rob's dark eyes and started crying before she said a word. Mom, please, let people help you. Tears came to Kate's own face from the weight of carrying everything alone for so long that she'd forgotten how heavy it was. I don't know how. Then learn, please. The decision came slowly. A gradual acceptance that control and doing everything alone weren't the same thing. Ron could handle equipment and fieldwork. Jimmy Sullivan, Jim's youngest son, 22 and capable, could work the milking parlor part-time for $380 a week. Kate could keep the financial decisions, the breeding program, the strategic planning. Distribution wasn't weakness. It was architecture. Building systems that didn't require her to be everything everywhere all the time. The farm ran better after that, smoother. Freed from the tyranny of her own competence, Kate found space to think instead of just react. The books balanced easier, the breeding decisions improved, the margins widened, her health stabilized. Dr. Thompson monitored her quarterly adjusted medications, approved the changes she'd made. You're doing better, Mrs. Anderson. Heart's responding well. Whatever you changed, keep changing it. By 1986, the operation hummed. 48 cows, all high-quality genetics. 420 acres in production. 2 employees plus seasonal help. Debt still 0. Savings climbing towards 6 figures. Kate turned 54 that September. Looked in the mirror and saw a woman who'd survived what was supposed to break her. The gray had taken over most of her hair, lines carved deep around her eyes and mouth, hands permanently weathered from 10 years of work that didn't allow for softness. But she was standing. Still owned everything. Still owed nothing. That counted for something. Christopher called in October 1987. Her son, 35 years old, voice tight with the particular shame of a man who'd built one kind of life and watched it collapse. Mom, I lost my job. Pillsbury downsized. 3-month severance. Silence on the line while Kate processed. Chris had left the farm at 18, swore he'd never come back, built a career in corporate agriculture in Minneapolis. Made decent money, wore suits, talked about market analysis like it mattered more than soil. I might need to come home. Might doesn't milk cows, Christopher. More silence. She could hear him breathing, working up to something. If I'm serious about learning, really learning, not just hiding, is their work. Kate looked out the kitchen window at the farm that had tested her and shaped her and nearly broken her. There's always work. Question is whether you're ready for what it teaches. Chris arrived 2 weeks later in a Honda Civic packed with boxes. Divorced, no kids, everything he owned fitting in a compact car. He looked tired in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. Kate put him in the old foreman's house, 2 bedrooms, functional, empty since Ron had his own place. Started him on basic tasks. Breeding records first, teaching him to track genetics, production cycles, health histories. Details that seemed boring until you understood they compounded into either profit or loss. He made mistakes. Expected them faster, simpler, easier. The corporate world had trained him to move quick and iterate. Farming required patience he'd forgotten or never learned. June 1988 brought his most expensive lesson. Chris bought feed supplement without checking prices first. Premium blend at $3.40 per bag when the standard stuff ran $1.85. Marginal production gain of maybe 2%. Kate made him calculate the return on investment, sat him down at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, and made him work through the math. 9 months. 9 months to break even on the extra cost. Chris's face flushed. It was one mistake. One mistake with your own money is education. One mistake with borrowed money is catastrophe. That's the difference. I was trying to improve production. By spending money we don't need to spend to gain production we don't need to have. That's not improvement. That's waste dressed up as ambition. He absorbed that slowly. Started asking before spending. Started checking prices, comparing options. Thinking about return instead of just results. By 1989, he was managing co-op meetings, representing the farm to vendors and buyers, handling negotiations Kate didn't have time for. She watched him grow into someone more useful than the kid who'd left at 18 or the corporate analyst who'd returned broken. The farm kept evolving. 50 cows by 1989. Production steady at 20,000 pounds per animal. Margins healthy. Savings account crossed 100,000 in early 1990. That summer, Brandon came to visit. Christopher's son, 10 years old, summer break from school in Minneapolis. Blonde hair like Kate's used to be curious eyes that noticed everything. He followed her around the farm, asking questions that started simple and got complicated fast. Why do you keep that old tractor? Grandma Dad says we could buy a new one. They were standing near the Farmall M, the tractor that had saved her winter of 1977 that she'd rented to Ron in 1980, that still started every morning without complaint. Kate sat on the porch swing and patted the seat beside her. Brandon climbed up. This tractor was the first thing your grandpa and I bought together. Spring of 1952. We were married 2 months, paid $2,400 cash. Took us 2 years to save that much. Brandon swung his feet, listening. When your grandpa died, people said I'd have to sell everything. They were wrong. Want to know why? Because you didn't owe money. Because I could choose. Bad weather, bad prices, bad health, none of it could force my hand. That's freedom, Brandon. Not doing whatever you want. It's not being forced to do what you don't. She let that settle before continuing. This tractor lived through your grandpa's death, through a barn fire, through the worst drought in 40 years, through interest rates that destroyed farms all over this county. You know what? It still starts every morning. Every single time. Why? Because we can fix it. We understand it. We truly own it. New tractors are faster, stronger, fancier. But when they break, you need the dealer. You need the loan. You need permission. This old tractor never needed anyone's permission, and neither did I. The boy looked at the field stretching west, at the barn, at the cows grazing peacefully. Will I run the farm someday? If you want it, yes. But only if you understand something. Success isn't being the biggest. It's still standing when everyone else quit. Can you be patient when everyone's rushing? Can you say no when everyone says yes? Brandon thought for a long moment. I can try, Grandma. Kate hugged him. Then you're wiser than I was at your age, and wiser than your grandpa was at his. It makes you wonder, is real wealth what you own or what doesn't own you? Ron walked past carrying a toolbox headed toward the west barn. He'd been working for Kate for 7 years now, transformed from the proud neighbor who'd offered to buy her out into something quieter and more durable. He taught AG classes at the community college 2 nights a week, talking to young farmers about risk management and debt exposure and the difference between growing fast and growing sustainable. People listened to him because he'd lost everything, had credibility that came from failure instead of success. Kate respected that, took courage to stand in front of a classroom and admit you'd been wrong about fundamental things. Rebecca visited in August with her kids. The relationship between mother and daughter had thawed over the years, though it would never be warm. Too much said and unsaid during the hardest years. But they'd found peace in mutual respect, if not understanding. You did it, Mom. 14 years. No debt. Thriving. Kate poured iced tea and they sat on the porch watching the kids play in the yard. We didn't just survive Becca. We stayed free. There's a difference. What's next? Teaching Brandon what Rob taught me. That staying unlevered mattered more than growing fast. The words felt true saying them. Kate had learned through fire and drought and loneliness that freedom wasn't about having everything. It was about owing nothing. Not just to banks, but to anyone's expectations about what her life should look like. Fall arrived with color that felt earned. September turned the trees gold and red. October brought harvest managed by Chris, while Ron handled storage and Jimmy kept the dairy running smooth. Kate sat at Rob's desk one evening in late October and opened the ledger. 52 cows up from 23 in 1976, 420 acres, 127,000 in savings, equipment paid for, land paid for. The debt column hadn't changed in 14 years. Still zero. She closed the book and looked at Rob's empty chair, worn smooth from years of him sitting there, doing this same accounting. The grief had worn smooth too, still present but no longer cutting. Thank you for showing me that the best investment isn't growth, it's independence. Outside, the barn light came on automatically. The cows were bedded down, the equipment stored. Tomorrow morning, the alarm would ring at 4:30 and she'd choose to answer it. That choice made freely every day for 14 years was the whole point. Brandon would inherit that freedom if he wanted it. The freedom to say no when everyone else said yes. The freedom to walk slow toward something sustainable instead of running fast toward collapse. Have you ever held on to something everyone told you to let go of and been proven right? Or watched someone you love make the hard, slow choice that paid off years later? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be the encouragement someone needs today. Kate turned off the desk lamp. Her knees ached. Her hands would never smooth out, but she owned this farm completely. Not the bank, not the market, just her. And that was sufficient. Epilogue. The Grandson's Choice. 2003, Brandon Anderson stood in the equipment shed with an envelope in his back pocket that felt heavier than paper should. 23 years old, Iowa State diploma, 3 weeks fresh, and a job offer from Cargill in Chicago, paying $58,000 a year plus benefits. The envelope had been there for 5 days. He hadn't told anyone yet. The Farmall M sat in front of him, same place it had been parked since his first summer visit in 1990. 13 years, and the tractor looked exactly the same. Maybe that was the problem. His grandmother was in the barn doing evening check, 67 years old and still walking the stalls every night, counting cows, checking udders, making sure nothing had changed since morning. Brandon had watched her do it for 3 summers during college breaks, watched his father Chris do the afternoon version, watched the whole operation run with the precision of machinery that had been calibrated over decades. 52 cows, 420 acres, 0 debt. The mantra he'd heard his entire life. The Cargill office would have glass walls and climate control. The farm had a barn that leaked when the wind came from the north and equipment that predated his birth. The choice should have been obvious. Brandon heard footsteps on gravel, his father coming from the west fields, where they'd been checking fence line all afternoon. Chris was 49 now, gray threading through his hair hands as weathered as the barnwood. You're thinking too loud. I can hear it from 50 yards. Brandon pulled the envelope from his pocket and handed it over without speaking. Chris read it slowly in the fading September light face, giving nothing away. 58,000. That's real money. It is. Chicago's not that far. 4 hours. You could visit. I could. Chris folded the letter and handed it back. Your grandmother's going to ask what you're thinking at dinner. You ready to answer? Brandon looked at the Farmall M again. Thing was built in 1950. When I was 10, Grandma told me this tractor never needed anyone's permission. Now I'm trying to figure out if I need permission to leave. Permission and choice aren't the same thing. They walked toward the house together. Kate had dinner ready, pot roast potatoes, carrots from the garden, the same meal she'd been making on Thursdays for 30 years. Rebecca and her husband Tim were coming over bringing their youngest, who was starting college next year. A family dinner that happened once a month like clockwork. Kate set the roast on the table and looked at Brandon with those green eyes that missed nothing. You've been carrying something around for days. Might as well put it on the table with the food. Brandon glanced at his father. Chris gave the smallest nod. I got a job offer. Cargill, Corporate Ag Division. Good salary, benefits, start in 2 weeks. Kate sat down carefully. What kind of work? Supply chain analysis, optimizing grain purchasing and distribution networks. Rebecca arrived in time to hear the last sentence. She hugged her nephew and sat down across from him. That's wonderful, Brandon, Chicago. Yeah. The table went quiet. Kate passed the potatoes. Everyone served themselves with the exaggerated focus of people avoiding eye contact. Finally, Kate spoke. What do you want to do? I don't know. That's the problem. What's making it hard? Brandon set down his fork. This farm runs perfectly. You've built something that works. But it works because you're all here doing it. Dad handles operations. Jimmy does milking. You still manage the books. If I stay, I'm just another hand. If I leave, I'm walking away from something Grandpa built and you saved. Kate cut her roast into precise pieces. Your grandfather didn't build this farm for you to feel trapped by it. He built it so you'd have choices. But what if my choice is wrong? Then you make a different choice later. Your father left. He came back. Neither decision killed him. Chris spoke up. I left because I thought farming was small. Came back because I learned corporate life was smaller. You're not me, Brandon. Maybe Chicago's exactly where you need to be, Rebecca added. You're 23. If you hate it, you can leave. If you love it, you stay. Either way, you'll know something you don't know now. The conversation moved on to other things: Rebecca's youngest daughter's college applications, grain prices, the weather forecast. But Brandon barely heard it. He kept looking at his grandmother, trying to read what she wouldn't say. After dinner, Kate walked out to the porch. Brandon followed. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun drop behind the west barn. Finally, Kate spoke. When your grandfather died, everyone told me to sell. Said I couldn't handle it alone. They were probably right in a lot of ways. But I stayed because leaving felt like admitting I'd never been capable in the first place. Pride, more than sense. Is that bad? Depends. Pride kept me here long enough to learn I actually could handle it. But pride also kept me alone longer than I needed to be. Took me years to accept help. Your father suffered for that. Rebecca did too. Brandon watched the barn swallows diving in the evening air. So, what do I do? Kate didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. Your grandfather used to say, debt is leverage against your future. You borrow assuming tomorrow will be better than today. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. The question isn't whether to borrow. It's whether you can survive being wrong. I'm not talking about money. Neither am I. Chicago's a different kind of leverage. You're betting on a future you haven't built yet. Maybe it works out. Maybe it doesn't. The farm is something you already know. The question is whether knowing is worth more than discovering. Brandon absorbed that. After a long pause, he asked, What would you do? Go to Chicago. His head snapped around. What Kate's face was calm. You need to see what's out there. Need to test yourself against something that isn't this farm. Your father had to learn the hard way that corporate life wasn't for him. You might learn the opposite. Either way, you'll make a better choice afterward than you can make now. But the farm will be here. Or it won't. That's not your responsibility to figure out at 23. 3 days later, Brandon accepted the Cargill offer. 2 weeks after that, he loaded his Honda with boxes and drove to Chicago on a Sunday morning. Kate stood on the porch and waved once. Didn't cry. Didn't say anything beyond call when you get there. The city swallowed him whole. The Cargill office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in the Loop. Brandon's cubicle had a view of other cubicles. His work involved spreadsheets analyzing grain futures, transportation costs, storage optimization, numbers divorced from dirt and weather and animals. Clean, abstract, efficient. He was good at it. By December, he'd impressed his supervisor enough to get assigned to a strategic project analyzing the profitability of industrial dairy consolidation in the Midwest. The premise was simple. Large operations using recombinant bovine growth hormone could produce 30% more milk per cow. If Cargill could finance the consolidation of 10 to 15 small dairies into 3 industrial operations, the efficiency gains would be substantial. Brandon's job was running the numbers. He pulled data on farms across Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin. Production volumes, debt loads, operating costs. Built models showing how economies of scale would drive margins. The math worked beautifully. Consolidate, leverage, optimize. Late January, his supervisor called him into a conference room with the division VP. They wanted him to do site visits, talk to farmers, assess which operations were vulnerable enough to consider selling. Your background gives you credibility, the VP said. Farm kid who chose business. You understand both worlds. That's valuable. Brandon flew to Des Moines the next week, rented a car, drove to 3 farms in 2 days, met with families who were tired behind on equipment loans, watching milk prices slide while feed costs climbed, showed them Cargill's offer, buy their land, absorb their debt, hire them as managers for industrial operations that would triple output. 2 of the 3 farmers were interested. The third, a woman about Kate's age with 30 cows and 80 acres, listened politely, then asked, "What happens to the cows?" They'd be folded into the larger herd. More efficient feeding protocols, RBST supplementation, optimized milking schedules. The woman's face hardened. "I don't use hormones. Never have. The new operation would require it. Industry standard for maximum production." She stood up. "Then we're done here. I'd rather go broke honest than rich on shortcuts." Brandon drove back to Des Moines, thinking about his grandmother. He called her that night from the hotel, told her about the project, the numbers, the efficiency gains. Kate listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You remember what I told you about that tractor? How it never needed permission?" "Yeah. Debt is permission. Hormones are permission. Anything that makes you dependent on someone else's schedule, someone else's prices, someone else's idea of how things should work, that's permission. Some people are fine with that. I wasn't." Brandon stared at the hotel ceiling. "The math works, Grandma. The consolidated operations would be more profitable. For who? The investors. The parent company. Eventually the farmers too, if milk prices stay high, if feed stays cheap, if nothing breaks. You're building a house on assumptions. We built a house on land." He flew back to Chicago the next day and turned in his assessment. The VP was pleased, authorized him to make formal offers to the 2 interested farmers. Brandon drafted the contracts, sent them out, waited for signatures. Both farmers signed. Cargill moved forward. Brandon got a raise. March brought milk price collapse. Overproduction from industrial operations flooded the market. Prices dropped 18% in 6 weeks. The 2 farmers who'd sold to Cargill were fine. They'd taken cash buyouts. But the woman who'd refused was hemorrhaging money. Brandon saw her farm on a vulnerability list 2 weeks later, flagged as high risk for foreclosure. Cargill wanted him to make another approach. He drove out there on a Saturday, found her in the barn doing afternoon milking by herself. She looked 10 years older than January. "I heard milk crashed." She didn't look up from the cow she was working on. "It did. I know we didn't end well last time, but Cargill's offer is still open. Maybe better now considering I'm desperate. Considering the market changed." She finished the cow and moved to the next one. Her hands were shaking slightly. "You seem like a good kid, so I'm going to tell you something your spreadsheet won't. This farm has been in my family for 90 years. My grandfather bought it cash in 1913. My father expanded it cash in 1948. I inherited it clear in 1987. 30 cows, 80 acres, 0 debt." She looked at him directly for the first time. "I'm losing money Every month right now. Probably lose it for 6 more months until prices recover. But I can survive because I don't have a loan payment. Your consolidated operations can't. They're leveraged at 70%. If this price drop lasts through summer, they'll fold. That won't happen. You sure Brandon drove back to Chicago thinking about exposure? April proved the woman right. Milk prices stayed depressed. One of Cargill's consolidated operations missed a loan payment. The bank extended 30 days. The second operation missed the following month. May brought crisis. Cargill's Ag Division VP called an emergency meeting. The industrial dairy project was underwater. Both consolidated operations were at risk of foreclosure. The company would take significant losses. Brandon sat in the conference room, listening to executives discuss cutting losses, selling assets, restructuring debt. All the language of failure dressed up as strategy. Someone asked, "What about the original farmers, the ones who sold?" "They're fine. They took cash. It's our problem now." The woman with 30 cows was still farming, still losing money monthly, still standing. Brandon requested vacation time the next week, drove to Iowa, pulled into his grandmother's driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. Kate was in the garden pulling weeds. She looked up when the car door shut, didn't seem surprised. "You look like you've been thinking hard." "I have. Kitchen or porch. They sat in the same spots as last September." Brandon told her everything. The consolidation project, the contracts, the price, collapse, the foreclosures. The woman with 30 cows who'd refused to sell and was surviving what Cargill's leveraged operations couldn't. Kate listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "Math looks different depending on what you're measuring. You were measuring profit. She was measuring survival. Both are right. Just different questions. Cargill wants me to help restructure, find more farmers to consolidate, spread the risk. And I keep thinking about what you said, about debt being permission. Those farmers gave Cargill permission to decide their future. Now, their future is whatever Cargill decides it is." Kate pulled a dandelion and dropped it in her bucket. "Your grandfather once told me, the best investment isn't growth, it's independence." Took me years to understand he wasn't talking about money. He meant the ability to make your own choices when things go wrong. Brandon looked at the farm spread out before them. 52 cows grazing peacefully. The barn solid against the sky. The Farmall M parked where it had always been. "I think I want to come home." Kate didn't react immediately. Finally, she said, "Why? Because Chicago taught me what I already knew. I just needed to see it from the other side." "What did you learn? That efficiency and stability aren't the same thing. That optimizing for growth means assuming nothing goes wrong. And things always go wrong." Kate stood up and brushed dirt from her knees. "Your father's been talking about slowing down. 65 acres that need better management. If you're serious about coming back, there's work. I'm serious. Then we'll talk to your father tonight." Brandon called Cargill the next morning and gave 2 weeks' notice. His supervisor tried to convince him to stay. The VP called personally. They offered more money, a promotion, relocation assistance. He declined all of it. The last day at Cargill, Brandon cleaned out his cubicle and looked at the Chicago skyline one final time. 18 months in the city had taught him something his grandmother couldn't have explained in words. You had to see the alternative to understand why someone chose what looked like the harder path. He drove back to Iowa with everything he owned in the same Honda, pulled into the farm at sunset. Kate was on the porch waiting. They didn't talk much that first night, just sat and watched the light fade over fields that would be his responsibility now. The weight of it settled on him, different than it had at 23. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The farm wasn't perfect. The barn still leaked. The equipment was still old. Milk prices were still depressed, but the debt column was still 0. And that 0 meant Brandon could make choices based on what was right, rather than what the bank demanded. 3 months later, milk prices recovered. Cargill sold both consolidated operations at a loss. The woman with 30 cows was still farming. She called Brandon once to say thank you for not pushing harder in March. He told her she'd taught him more than he'd taught her. By fall, Brandon had taken over the West acreage. Chris moved to advisory role, handling breeding decisions and long-term planning. Kate stepped back from daily operations, but still walked the barn every evening. Some habits were too deep to break. One October evening, Brandon found her in the equipment shed standing in front of the FarmLife. She had her hand on the hood the way you'd touch something alive. "You were right," he said. "About going to Chicago. I needed to see what else was out there. And now I know why you stayed." Kate smiled slightly. "Why's that?" "Because the farm doesn't own us. We own it. That's worth more than any salary." She patted the tractor once and turned to leave, stopped at the door and looked back. "Your grandfather would have liked you." "You think like he did. Slow and careful. Is that a compliment? From me always." Brandon stayed at the shed after she left, stood in front of the FarmLife, the way his grandmother had. The tractor would outlive him probably, would outlive his children if he had any. Some things were built to last because they were built to be maintained, not replaced. He understood now why Kate had told him to go. Some lessons couldn't be taught, only learned. The difference between knowing and understanding was experience, and experience required making the choice yourself. Chicago had been necessary, not because it showed him what he wanted, but because it showed him what he didn't. The corporate world optimized for efficiency. The farm optimized for resilience. Both were valid, but only one gave you permission to fail without losing everything. Brandon turned off the shed light and walked toward the house. Tomorrow morning, the alarm would ring at 4:30. The cows would need milking, the farm would need running, and he'd choose to answer that call the same way his grandmother had for 27 years. The choice was his. That's what mattered, not the size of the operation or the efficiency of the equipment or the salary he wasn't earning. The ability to choose freely because nothing owned him back. He'd tell his grandmother that someday. Maybe she already knew. Probably did. Kate Anderson didn't miss much. For now, he'd just show her. One morning at a time. One season at a time. Building something that would last. Not because it was the biggest or the fastest or the most profitable, but because it was paid for and sustainable and free. The FarmLife would still be there in 50 years if someone maintained it. So would the farm. That was the whole point, building something that outlasted the builder, not through debt or leverage or perfect timing, just through patience and discipline and the stubborn refusal to trade independence for growth. Brandon went inside. Kate was at the kitchen table with the ledger open, running the same calculations she'd been running for almost 3 decades. She looked up when he entered. "Everything locked up. Everything's good." She nodded and went back to her numbers. Brandon poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, watched her work with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Some things didn't need changing. The farm would be his someday. 52 cows and 420 acres and 0 debt. Not a burden, a gift. The gift of choices made freely without permission from banks or markets or anyone else. His grandmother had fought for that freedom when everyone said she couldn't. His father had returned to it after learning what life without it cost. Now it was Brandon's turn to protect it, to build on it, to prove that the quiet discipline of staying unlevered mattered more than the loud celebration of growth. Outside, the Iowa night settled in. The cows were bedded down, the equipment was stored, the books would balance like they always did, and tomorrow morning, the FarmLife would start, because some things were built right the first time and never needed replacing. Just maintenance, just care. Just someone who understood that the best tools are the ones that never own you back. Brandon finished his coffee and said goodnight, walked to the foreman's house that was his now. Lay in bed listening to the farm breathe around him. This was home. Not because he'd never left, but because he'd left and chosen to return. That made all the difference. The choice was his. And he'd made it freely. That was worth more than any salary Cargill could offer.